It's online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Who dares question MIT economists? I'll tell you who. James Heckman and his colleague at the University of Chicago. Very interesting. The question whether zip code is destiny. And this is not an inconsequential question because, of course, you have policymakers that are always looking to, in the name of equity, provide opportunity to neighborhoods and communities that are allegedly deprived of opportunity. And so if moving to a high opportunity neighborhood would benefit people in a low opportunity neighborhood, well, then just start moving people from, the south side of Chicago to Winnetka, and everything's going to work out well for all parties involved, right? It's based on this paper from 7 years ago by two MIT economists that basically argue that there's a causal relationship between neighborhoods and outcomes for children in terms of education, lifetime earnings, those sorts of things. Well, this has been examined, as I mentioned, by James Heckman and a colleague of his at Chicago, and they have a different understanding of what the dynamic is here, and it has real-world public policy implications. For example, as Heckman notes in his piece, $50 million project authorized by Congress that began in August 2022 will run until 2028 to move families to quote-unquote opportunity neighborhoods in Cleveland, Minneapolis, L.A., Nashville, Tennessee, New Orleans, New York City, Pittsburgh, Rochester, L.A., and in L.A. alone, officials using $4 million from the project to relocate 1,950 families. I'm surprised Chicago isn't on the list of this too. Anything, that represents the zeitgeist in big blue cities usually includes Chicago. For more on the topic, please be joined by Professor Heckman, who's not only an economics professor at the University of Chicago and a senior fellow at the Archbridge Institute. He's also a 2000 Nobel laureate in economics. We don't get to talk to Nobel laureates that much. Professor Heckman, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, it's good to be able to talk about these questions because I completely agree with you that these issues are not really stated very clearly or very honestly. And I think it's huge for public policy that we really examine what the evidence shows, and not only what it shows, but what's missing and what needs to be added to the public policy discussion.
So give us, in your words, the conclusion that was drawn from the researchers at MIT, and then what you and your colleague concluded from your research.
Well, the researchers and their allies, there are a number of people, the large foundations like Gates and MacArthur and many other more liberal or progressive foundations have supported this work very actively. And their conclusion was that if you put a child in a better neighborhood, and they measured neighborhood quality by asking how well people in that neighborhood succeeded when they grew up as adults. And they had a very crude measure. They used Internal Revenue Service data that was, for many years, not even available to most researchers. When I originally discussed the paper at Princeton some 7 years ago, making essentially the same point, I couldn't even get access to the data, even though I was promised it. Nonetheless, the New York Times, just before the discussion, presented a whole upshot column and range of issues, essentially reiterating, and supporting this kind of evidence. The key idea is basically move people to better places, and they'll be better people. And what's nuance is that we move the children of these people to better places, and if we do so, that means that the children will grow up to be healthy, thriving adults and will do better than if they stayed in their old neighborhoods. And the problem that I see, and I think is very important, is the fact that nobody in this analysis takes into account the role of the family and the fact that the family is playing a critical role. They look at data. It's not an experiment they're looking at. They're looking at some kind of concocted econometric exercise along details, which I'm sure your listeners don't want to hear. But the fact is that the idea is that if you put a kid in in a good neighborhood for another few years, that child will do even better than if you take the child and keep him in the old neighborhood or give him fewer years of exposure to the good neighborhood. And so there was a notion that the neighborhood was really playing a central role and that relocation was essentially the key. Well, let me be very clear. I want to be very clear that good neighborhoods with good schools, low crime rate, better peers, there's no question that helps children and helps parents pick the neighborhoods and schools for their children. There's no question. But, and this is the key part that's missing, what people are not looking into is the role of the parent in choosing those neighborhoods. What we found was that parents who are more advantaged and that parents where children are thriving are ones who locate in good neighborhoods even before the child is born. And so my co-author, Sadek Esagnia, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago, came up with a very clever idea. Namely, he used the methodology of these researchers and said, okay, look, they're saying that the exposure to the neighborhood should essentially be the story that helps them succeed or fail in life. So he points out something very interesting that illustrates the critical role of the parents. It turns out that when parents locate and parents locate to better neighborhoods, that parents, who are more concerned in this regard, when they look at the birth weight of the child, before the child even grows up in the neighborhood, before the child even arrives in the world, that the birth weight and the birth length essentially are much better, much higher for those parents who make the choices early and who show concern and care for the parent. And therefore, the story really is not about where the parents placed the kid as much as what the parents cared about. And so things like child health, the reason why I mentioned birth weight is that birth weight and birth length are both very strong predictors of later success in life. And so those initial decisions made by parents and the fact that it's the caring parents that matter. The authors of these studies will make another argument and say, well, look, we look at siblings of children who move to these neighborhoods. And the siblings of children, the younger children who move to the neighborhoods, benefit a lot, too, when they move to the neighborhood. But they fail to understand the crucial role of parenting. And this is a study that gets totally neglected in public policy. And that is, what do parents do? Parents pick the neighborhoods. Parents exploit the benefits of the neighborhoods. One of the recurring studies in many of these areas is basically that when you give people universal opportunities, you give people this, that, or the other thing, it's the more concerned parents, the more committed parents who actually end up giving their children those advantages, accessing them. So even though we have a universal welfare state, say, or universal environments, it's the parents who exploit the advantages of those environments. And so it gets to the basic point that America is not willing to discuss. And housing is just another superficial, Band-Aid on a problem that's deep. And the deep problem is the American family, which is in free fall in many quarters of the society and needs to be addressed. And we can do it. And there are ways to go about it, but they're not necessarily government programs, but government programs can be instituted that help teach parenting, that foster the engagement that make the child successful. And so these other programs, people want to have universal basic income. There's another whole line of research. So, and the universal basic income, which Cook County does have, to the discredit of Tony Preckwinkle and this group, has been shown universally to have no effect on child outcomes. I mean, even the most avid advocates, millions and millions of dollars have been spent A recent paper issued by the NBER pointed out that after millions spent, there was no greater gain. No greater gain by just giving people money. What's missing, and the crucial ingredient of American life that's missing now, is parents and parenting. And so I think it's really important that we refocus our attention on what I think is the central problem in American society. It's not better housing. It's not this. It's not that. It's actually really getting parents engaged and having parents who are concerned about their own children and willing to protect them. As an example, we know in Chicago that we had many families living in the Robert Taylor homes. And if it was all just environment, we would think every one of those kids living in the Robert Taylor homes would be a criminal, would grow up to be somehow disordered, and somehow a violent member of society. Some did, but quite a few didn't. And the secret ingredient was always the mother, the family, the caretaker, whoever was in charge of the life of the child, actually taking an active ingredient and protecting the child against that environment.
Well, and you.
So I think that's what's. Well, sorry, I'm not talking too much.
No, that's fine. But I wanted you to, because there's also in addition to what's going on right now, you mentioned, you also reference in your piece in the 1990s there was a quote unquote move to opportunity program experiment, and we should look at efforts that have been made in this direction in the past based on this theory that didn't work out so well. So what happened with move to opportunity?
Well, movement to opportunity had some effect. If you looked at happiness of the children, it had some effect on child outcomes. But when you look at the children as adults, no effect. And in fact, even the proponents of this program will argue that as well. So the fact is that there wasn't any lasting effect. But I will put it this way. Moving to opportunity also was highly selective. Which children actually which families participated? Not all families offered the bills, the subsidies that allowed them to move to opportunity, took up the vouchers they were giving them. Some of them chose not to.
It's like school. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's like school vouchers. I mean, they're available, but it's the motivated parent who wants a better educational opportunity for their kid that's going to seek out the scholarship. So
exactly.
So
and
there's
also
self-selection.
The better motivated parent who wants to seek out the housing voucher to lead the kid to a better environment.
Right.
And that was not accounted for in these studies. You see, there's another whole issue here. We could go on for hours, and you don't want that. I'm not going to do it for you. But the fact is that there's this blind belief in this kind of very simple-minded statistics. You run an experiment, but you don't notice who is it who took part in that experiment. Everybody doesn't participate. There's a lot of non-participation. Who wanted these opportunities? So I agree. I think I'd be out of my mind if I said better schools didn't help children.
Yeah.
We know that's true. We also know that better neighborhoods where children can play and be free of fear and crime and all that clearly can't hurt. But the people who pick those, who make those neighborhoods viable and make it valuable for their children, are the parents. and they just get factored out of the equation.
Right.
Because you know why? I'll tell you why. And you know exactly why. And that is because parenting in certain racial, ethnic groups is a disaster. And it leads then to a society-wide disaster. People don't want to talk about it. That's the problem.
And and other people want to conclude there's a, like the MIT researchers, that there's this causal effect. If you just move them, then this will occur, and it's that simple. And of course, as you're saying, it's not that simple. The birth length thing, it was funny because I read Alex Tabarrok, who's a economist at George Mason, as I'm sure you know. Yeah, he loves the using birth length instead of adult earnings. He says obviously moving can't affect birth length, yet your colleague in his placebo experiment finds that children parents who move to taller neighborhoods have taller children. In parallel with the MIT researchers find that children parents who move to higher income neighborhoods have higher income children, which is basically a way to submarine their contention and say obviously this is not causal.
Right. No, it's funny. It's funny. I have a story like this that might, if you have enough time for me to tell it,
Sure.
which is a few years ago, I was working for the United Nations. I did a study of inequality in Panama, poverty in Panama. outside the canal zone, the country's pretty poor. But when I was there doing this study for the UN, there was a housing project that was built by the dictator. Actually, it was Noriega and his government at the time, but not so important, Noriega. But what happened is they brought in a group of indigenous people from the jungle to give them the opportunity to live in Panama City in modern housing. And the beautiful thing about the experiment, yes, they gave them these nice high-rise buildings with big balconies. Well, what happened? When the indigenous people came to Panama City, they brought with them their culture. What was their culture? Cooking food on open fires. Mm-hmm. Where did they cook their food? They cooked their food on their balconies. And sure enough, you can imagine what happened to the buildings. They burned up. And this is the mentality of sociologists and people who don't want to think about choice that people make. That's the thing. It's amazing how thick-minded people are about these things. They want to argue that it's everything but the family factors. Choice doesn't matter. They want to argue that we're zombies, that people are automatons, and there's no role for understanding how to make choices better, and to promote choice, but not to. So anyway, I think it's a kind of study. It's very attractive to many people. But you see, it's a palliative. The idea would be we give these people vouchers. We don't tackle the fundamental failure of American family life in many quarters of society. And interestingly enough, Obama and many spokesmen for the Black community have focused specifically on fathers, have focused specifically on marriages and families. And even, recently now in this case in Michigan where a group of people who had a family that had a son who committed a murder in our school, the parents were held responsible. And that was a wonderful path-breaking. Parents are responsible. And somehow the notion of responsibility and the role of a parent is minimized because there are too many parents out there who are not responsible and probably shouldn't be parents, but definitely are, and they definitely do harm for the society at large.
James Heckman, econ professor, University of Chicago, senior fellow at the Archbridge Institute, and a 2000 Nobel laureate in economics. Professor Heckman, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Good to talk to you.
Okay. Take care.
And Professor Heckman joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
My friend Paula just remodeled her kitchen. I feel bad. It's so